All right, good morning, everybody. At this point, you are probably either at the point where you've given your first major speech or you're about to give your major speech, so I'll say either congratulations or good luck. I'll also tell you what I tried to tell you a few weeks ago. I tried to warn you all that this class was going to move pretty quickly after you got through that first speech. I've been trying to give you all the history and theory you need to get through a speech generally. You'll use a lot of those same tools to help yourself with your other two speeches that you're going to give in this class. So we're in week 8 right now, and a lot of you are just giving your first speech now, and so you've had a lot of opportunity to prepare for that first speech. What I tried to warn you about is that between now and the end of the semester, you still have 2 more speeches to give. You have a technical speech that you will give about a month from now, and that includes spring break. You then have your final group deliberations that you'll have at the end of the semester. We're going to spend a fair amount of our time in lecture getting you ready for those other 2 speeches and talking through some issues that you might have. We have some other things on the agenda as well, but what I'd like to do today is to use our class period as an opportunity for you all to do some invention around that second speech. So you might not have had a chance to look at the assignment prompt for that, but the second speech is going to ask you to look for something either in your major or in your career. And a lot of students in the past have told me this is their favorite speech for this class, and it's probably the most useful speech for a lot of you. That said, it's not always the easiest speech to put together because some of you don't know where you're at in your career. You're not really sure what your next steps are, and some of you are close to the end of that. So we have a lot of options. I've intentionally left this speech pretty open-ended. What I'd like it to be for you is an opportunity to explore the next step in your career development. So whatever that happens to be, I want you to use this speech to help advance your career or maybe help you choose a major or think about some things that you'll have to think about when you go on the job market. So let's get started today. I have a list of different options up on the board here of where you're at in terms of your progress toward your degree and your career path. What I'd like you to do is read the options up on the board and show me on your fingers 1 through 6 where you're at. So you can look around the room, I'll look around the room and see a temperature of where we're at here. All right, I'm seeing a couple of 3s, 4s, and 5s. Lots of 5s, a couple 1s and 2s. Mostly 4 and 5. This doesn't surprise me all that much. I've been asking this question every semester since I've been here. Usually in the fall semester, I tend to get a lot of first and second year students, and I have people closer to the beginning of the spectrum here. So when I teach in the spring, a lot of you are taking this class as you're getting ready to graduate, and so maybe you've started figuring out where you're at. You have a pretty good sense of where you're going. I put this list up on the board not to make anyone feel shame if they don't know what their next step is or they don't really feel comfortable where you're at. Each person is going to go through a different journey on this process. I don't think I saw any 6s, but if I did, congratulations to you. That's pretty exciting. Even if I did see a couple of those, or if there are a couple of you, I've seen a few studies coming out of Forbes and Business Insider and places like that that say that people our age, people your age, people younger than you probably are not going to be very likely to stay in one career for your entire lifetimes. It was pretty common for our parents or our grandparents to pick a career and stick with it. The economy is changing in a lot of ways that are not necessarily conducive to that kind of mindset. And so even if you are ready to graduate and you have a job lined up for next year, you still may need to explore other options. You may need to see other opportunities. Regardless of where you're at on this list, what I'd like you to do is to think of what you might be able to say in your speech that would be useful to you as you get to the next step, but also useful to your classmates. One of the big challenges of the Techne speech is to take stuff from your field, stuff that you had to specialize in, and to be able to translate that to people outside of your field, and in a way that's exciting to those people outside of your field. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through a couple different options of what students have done in the past for this speech. Hopefully you can use this as an opportunity to think ahead for your next major speech, because it's going to come up quicker than you expect it to. And if you remember when we talked about the 5 canons, I told you that part of why I teach you that is to help you with time management. You want to make sure you leave yourself enough time to get through all 5 canons. You probably want to do them one at a time. So you probably want to get started on that invention process this week if you can. Now before we get there, I just want to do some free brainstorming. I want to do some word association. There's no right or wrong answer here, but raise your hand. Tell me what comes to mind when you hear the phrase technical communication. Or if you're not really sure what that means, just raise your hand and tell me what comes to mind when you hear the word technical. Okay, you think of a lot of numbers. Usually technical communication is charts and tables and graphs, things that you don't necessarily see in an English class, things that you wouldn't get in a philosophy class, more like things you would see in a science class or a marketing class. Good. What else comes to mind with technical communication? Or just technical generally? What are some words, what are some phrases, what are some ideas that come to your mind? Systemic? Okay. Good. So oftentimes, technical communication is really systemic. It's trying to be, usually it's a lot of lists or it's a lot of very detailed instructions. What often comes to mind for me is a car manual. That is, I often think of things that are really detailed lists. Raise your hand if you have ever read your car manual cover to cover. There's always like one or two of you. That seems to me like a particular kind of torture. I know that it's important to do, and I probably will do it at some point. But for the vast majority of us, if we are going to consult our car manual, it's because our tire just blew out, or our check engine light is on, or there's some dashboard indicator light that we don't understand, or something really bad just happened. We usually don't read our car manual cover to cover because a lot of people think it's kind of dry. They think it's kind of boring. They think they don't necessarily need all of that information until they absolutely need it in an emergency situation. So sometimes we don't always expect for us to read technical communication cover to cover. Oftentimes the way technical communication is designed is through things like manuals, instruction books, guides, if you have reports that you're doing. Anything that you do for your job is going to be really specific, and it's going to be for people who need information quickly, who need that information to be exactly what they need. They need it to be accessible. They need to know where to find it. I've taught a few classes in technical communication before, and oftentimes it's a really hard skill because it's not like telling a story. It's not like making an argument. It's not quite as fun in the traditional sense of other kinds of writing. That's the stereotype that often people associate with technical communication. And aside from the car manual, the other thing that comes to mind is Dilbert. It's some old white guy sitting in a cubicle. He may or may not like his job. He has kind of this dry sense of humor. The kinds of things that you would produce with technical communication are going to be very detailed. It's the kind of things where you need to dot your I's and cross your T's. And a lot of people don't like doing technical communication. Technical communication can happen and often does happen in writing, but a lot of people will also use technical communication in speech. If you're giving a marketing presentation, if you're giving a sales pitch, that's also a kind of technical communication. This is the stereotype that a lot of people associate with technical communication. This was pretty much true until the end of the 20th century, but I think I've noticed a trend at least, and I've talked to other people who teach technical communication. They're seeing a trend for it to be less like Dilbert and more like graphic design. That is, a lot of the things that we used to go to for technical communication, we can now find on the internet. So a lot of you, if you need to jumpstart your car or change a tire, are probably not going to read an instruction list. You're probably going to go to YouTube, or you might find a website. In any case, the way that technical communication is laid out is usually to try and be pretty user-friendly and to try to be pretty specific, but that doesn't mean that it has to be dry and boring. So that's traditionally what people teach as technical communication, and you'll get, if you take a class in technical communication, you'll get a lot of instructions on how to do reports and how to design manuals and how to communicate in ways that are clear and specific and direct and to the point and well organized so that other people in your field can relate to them. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of technical communication, but there's a broader history of the term technical as it relates to technical communication. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that that history goes back to the same history that we've been talking about. You'll hear me often in this class say that a lot of things go back to ancient Greece. The origins of the root technical come from ancient Greece. There's a word in ancient Greece called a techne. And a techne, as the ancient Greeks thought of it, was something like a profession as we would think about it today, or a career. A techne was something that somebody could become an expert in, something that somebody needed extra training in, something that someone needed extra language or theory in order to understand. something that could be taught, but only if you had kind of an apprentice model to it, and often something that contributed something back to Greek society. And so in Plato's dialogues, he has a dialogue called the Gorgias, where he and Socrates really is going around and pretty much trolling everybody in ancient Greece and asking them, okay, you call yourself an architect. What do you do and how is it different from everyone else's techne? You call yourself an artist. What does that do and how is it different? If you call yourself a politician, what does that do and how is it different? And around the same time that Plato and Socrates were living, there was a group of people called the Sophists. And the Sophists were people who were teaching the art of public speaking. And Socrates decides that he's going to interact with some of these Sophists, and he's going to ask them, what do you do and how is it similar to or different from what everybody else does, and what does it contribute back to society? Now the Sophists, and then within the category of Sophists, there was a group called logographers. And the logographers were kind of like early public speaking teachers. But what they did actually was teach people how to get what they wanted. In ancient Greece, if you wanted something done, you would go to the agora, which is kind of like the town square, and you would fight for why you should get what you want. So if you had a new project or if you had a new political idea, you would go and you would give a good speech. So the logographers were people who would teach people how to do public speaking, and they would often charge very high fees for it. They would usually do that because the people who would come to them for help either wanted to influence the political system or they were on trial for some kind of crime and wanted to learn how to defend themselves. So they spent a lot of time learning not just the art of public speaking, but also the art of what we're going to go into for the next few weeks, argumentation. They would learn how to make arguments, they'd learn how to support arguments with evidence and reasoning, and these logographers would charge them a lot of money. And Plato and Socrates saw this and saw that it was actually something that they were not thrilled with. They didn't like that these logographers were doing that, and part of why they didn't like that is because they had just experienced a war. And there were a whole bunch of people making speeches about why they should go to the war. And the Peloponnesian War was kind of a disaster for ancient Athens. It was one of the things that really traumatized Plato and Socrates. So they were talking to these logographers. They were talking in particular to a guy named Gorgias. And they asked him, what do you do? And he said, well, I teach people how to speak. And so Plato, in this dialogue, coins a new term. He actually coins the term rhetoric. And for about 2,400 of the last 2,500 years, that has been associated very closely with public speaking, but also with persuasion. My dissertation advisor used to say that when Plato coined the term rhetoric, he also put the ick in rhetoric. What she means by that is that Plato made rhetoric icky. Plato made rhetoric something that we look down upon, and it's a history that we've been contending with for those of us who study it since Plato first coined the term in this dialogue. If you've heard people use the word rhetoric in the United States in the 21st century, oftentimes it has a negative connotation with it. We talk about mere rhetoric. We talk about empty rhetoric. What we mean by that is rhetoric that is all fluff and no substance. It's kind of the worst ethical version of what we talked about last week. It's that bad person speaking well. And so rhetoricians have had to contend with this history, and even in pop culture in the 21st century, we still hear this from time to time.
I'm afraid that leg is hanging by a thread. Chico must return to game. Oh, your playing days are over, my friend. But you can always fall back on your degree in communications. Oh, dear Lord.
I know. It's funny, Major. Look, Chico learned nothing.
Now you can probably guess, as someone who has not one, not two, but 3 degrees in communication, how I feel about that. On the one hand, I find it funny and I like self-deprecating humor, and there are some communication programs that don't teach very well. However, I will also say that there's a reason why I decided to pursue communication, and that reason is that I was interested in just about everything. Communication is one of those fields that draws a lot from philosophy, sociology, political science, psychology. When I was an undergrad, if you had asked me the question I gave you at the beginning, I would have said, I don't know what my major is, and I have no idea what it's going to be, and that scares me because I'm interested in everything. Rhetoric was one of the fields that allowed me to study a little bit of everything, and we're going to go into the history of rhetoric a little bit more later in the semester. But part of why it interested me in the first place is because I could be interdisciplinary with it. That said, the critique that's often labeled against rhetoric and rhetoricians is that we are jack of all trades and masters of none. That means that if you are going to be interested in a little bit of everything, we have historians, we have philosophers, we have political scientists and politicians, we have lawyers. And so why do we need someone who is just specializing in the art of communication? That's essentially Plato's argument in the Gorgias, and that's the argument that often gets leveled against communication programs in the 21st century. That said, there is a famous 20th century rhetorician named Richard McKeon who makes a really good point, I think, that rhetoric is actually what he calls architectonic. That is, rhetoric is the architecture of every major that you could study at the university. And I know some of you hear that and you're probably pretty skeptical. You say, I'm a hard scientist, I'm an aviation major, I'm a biologist, I'm an engineer. I don't really understand the need for me to study or teach or take communication classes. What is it going to do for me? Well, McKeon says that you can't really succeed in any field without really understanding what communication is and how to do it well. And if you don't believe me on that, I'll tell you that the reason why I first got tasked with teaching technical communication is not because my department decided it was a good idea, but actually another department came to us and they said, you know, some of our students are taking public speaking, a lot of them are not, and we're a little worried. That department happened to be the petroleum engineering department at one of my former universities. So these were people in the oil industry, and they were graduating and they were going off getting jobs with big companies in the oil industry. And the head of that petroleum engineering department went to some big oil executives working for ExxonMobil, working for Schlumberger, and he said, you know, what do you think of our graduates? And the executive said, they're really smart, they're really hardworking, they don't know how to speak, and they don't know how to write. And so that put this head of the petroleum engineering department in a panic, and he came to the communication department and said, we need you to create a class for public speaking that is specifically designed for our petroleum engineers because they're getting jobs and they're not able to advance their careers. That same head of the petroleum engineering department I have on video, if any of you want to see it, saying that if you want to be a petroleum engineer and you don't want to get stuck working on an oil rig for the rest of your life, you have to learn how to give a good report. You have to learn how to make a good sales pitch. You have to learn how to talk to politicians, or you will not be able to advance your career. So you might not think that rhetoric or public speaking is very necessary for your career, but there's a reason why just about every communication department in the country has public speaking as their biggest class and their first required class that students are required to take. So I share all of this with you to get you thinking about what you might do or how you might use public speaking, not just for this second speech, but also to think about this second speech as an opportunity for you to think about how communication applies to your career. One of the ways that it does that is through resumes and cover letters. These are just the first things that you do to get in the door when you apply for a job. Raise your hand if you've ever written a resume before. Almost everyone in the room. Raise your hand if you've also written a cover letter. About half of you. That's pretty typical. A lot of people have not written cover letters, and cover letters are actually a really hard genre. So one of the things that you can do for this second speech is to actually give people some advice about how to prepare a good resume and cover letter, or maybe if you're close to the job market and you have a job interview lined up, you want to look into interviewing skills. There are lots of good textbooks, lots of good resources available for how to get a job and how to make sure that you get past the interview stage and actually get the job that you want. I'm going to go a little bit into how resumes and cover letters are rhetorical documents themselves, but if you wanted to give your second speech on how to do this better, you can do some additional research beyond what I have to say. So I'll start with resumes here, and when I think of resumes, I often think that they are rhetorical documents. That is, you are making an argument through your resume. It's not just this thing you cobble together because you have to. People take the format and the outline and the structure and the details of your resume very seriously. So one way to think about writing a resume is what we've been talking about all semester, using the 5 canons. A lot of what you're going to have to decide for how to format your resume is what to include and, more importantly, what not to include in your resume. Some of you probably don't have a whole lot of work experience right now, but maybe 20 or 30 years down the line, you probably don't want to talk about things that you did in high school or even in undergrad. So sometimes you have to rule out some things that are not relevant. You don't want to pad your resume because employers can kind of sniff that out and say they're trying to present themselves as better than they are. That has to do with invention. Sometimes we also have to think about the layout of our resumes. A lot of resumes historically have been chronological. That is, you go through your jobs and you say, here's what I did in 1998, here's what I did in 2004, here's what I did in 2012, here's what I'm doing now. And it'll go and list your jobs in order of when you had those jobs, and then within those categories, it'll list particular skills that you used when you were on the job. A lot of resumes in a lot of fields are changing from that chronological format to what's called a functional resume. Rather than listing and starting with your jobs, you instead list particular skills that you have, and in the subcategory, you list the jobs that you had and the tasks that you did that filled those particular skills. So that's something that has to do with arrangement. A lot of times, if you are listing your skills on your resume, you want to be very particular about what kind of action verbs you use to describe the tasks that you had to do at work. That word choice can matter a lot in terms of whether companies think of you as a leader or as a follower. So you might be able to use particular words like, I managed a team, I designed or crafted this thing. A lot of times we have to think about what words we're using. We also have to think about how we design our resumes. A lot of resumes, especially in the digital environment, are getting a little bit more tricky with graphic design. I would say those probably have more to do with style. So you can probably think of your resumes as something that uses the 5 canons. Another thing you want to make sure you think about is audience analysis. A lot of people who do resumes think first about why they want the job. That is, they think about, I want to live in this location. I want to work for this particular company. I want to do this these particular skills. I want to have this particular title. And it's kind of that self-centered mentality that I talked about with audience analysis, where you're not all a bunch of narcissists, but first and foremost, you're thinking about, what does this job do for me? When you're actually preparing to go on the job market, the company is not interested in what they can do for you. They're much more interested in what you can do for them. You want to demonstrate how you fit. You want to demonstrate how you can add something of value to that company. So you want to think about your resume in terms of audience analysis as well, because people can tell when you're doing things for your own best interests, even if it doesn't fit with the company's best interests. Now, a lot of you have written resumes, and you might be thinking, how do I go back and redo my resume now? I think that's a really good exercise. You might want to visit a career center. Not a lot of people have written cover letters, and I've seen a lot of really bad cover letters. So when I taught technical communication, these were 2 of my favorite assignments because students would write really bad first drafts of them, and I would sit them down and I would explain to them, I'm not saying this is bad to make you feel bad. I'm saying this is bad so that you don't get in the no pile. It's for your own protection. So to give you an example, I had a student in Texas who gave his resume, or started writing his cover letter. And he said, Dear search committee, I am very lucky. Jesus has blessed my family, and I haven't had to have jobs in the past. But I do want you to know that I'm a hard worker, and I'm ready to come to your company, and I'm excited to do what you want me to do. And then it went on for another paragraph or 2. Thanks, hugs and kisses, whatever, my name, right? That kind of cover letter, I had to explain to the student, would get him in the no pile in most places right away. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that student mentioned religion in their cover letter. Most companies are not legally allowed, and if they're legally allowed, usually there's company policy that they're not allowed to ask you about your religion. And so if you self-disclose that information, that's one thing, but you probably want to be careful to protect sensitive demographic information that could put you in the no pile. It's not just that the students shared their religion, but in sharing their religion, it also might signal to that employer that you are somebody who's going to talk about sensitive issues like religion and politics at work. And so I had to explain to this student that if he wanted a job in Central Texas, there were certain places that might be interested in the fact that he identified as Christian. But if he wanted to get a job in Dallas, Houston, Fargo, Chicago, wherever, and in any city, there are going to be people at that company who are A, not Christian, and B, may not be religious at all and may even be atheists. So you want to be careful not to share that kind of information. The other thing that was a little troubling to me as I read the student's cover letter is he said that he's been lucky that he hasn't had to have jobs in the past, that his family is pretty well off, he comes from money. To an employer, that's going to signal that that person might be pretty entitled. It also might signal that that person claims that they're a hard worker, but they don't actually know what hard work is because they haven't had to work for a living. So we had to brainstorm some other things that this student could say in his cover letter that maybe even though he hadn't had jobs in the past, he could have talked about organizations that he was a part of. He could have talked about leadership opportunities that he's had or special training that he's had. He could have talked about things that he was doing in his coursework that were directly relevant to the job. But you want to be very careful with things that you think might get you in the door because companies will be very skeptical of a lot of those things. Now, a couple other considerations for writing good cover letters. The first is that letter writing is a genre. In the Middle Ages, there were actually rhetoricians who would talk and study the art of writing letters, and people used to take it very seriously. In the 21st century, a lot of you are more inclined to, or more accustomed to writing emails. And emails are much less formal than the letters that our parents and grandparents and most bosses are familiar with. And so if you don't start off with a salutation, if you don't end with a closing statement, if you don't have a solid intro, body, and conclusion, your letter is going to read off compared to other applicants who do have those things. So you want to make sure that you're using this as an opportunity to demonstrate that you are a quality writer. You also want to be careful not just to rehash everything that's in your resume. What that signals to employers is that you think they can't read. What you instead want to do in your cover letter is to complement your resume. I had a student last semester who made a really good observation that your cover letter is kind of like the introduction to your speech, and your resume is kind of like your citations. I really like that a lot. What I like to think about for cover letters is you want to try and demonstrate not just the things that you did and how they're relevant to the company, but you want to demonstrate particular skills that you bring to the table and how those fit in with the company. You also want to demonstrate what you value and how your values align with the company values. Maybe the company has a mission statement. Maybe the company has particular things that it's trying to do. Ultimately, what you want to do is demonstrate that you fit within that organization. And some of that's going to come from doing some research on that organization. Why are they hiring in the first place? Did somebody recently get fired? And if so, what did they get fired for? Because you want to make sure you avoid that. Are they looking to expand? If they're creating a new division, what is that division going to do? And how do you fit within that division? How are you going to advance the mission of the company there? Ultimately, what you want to demonstrate is that you belong there and that you as a coworker will get along well with the other people who are already there. So resumes and cover letters, or maybe interviewing, are one genre that you could take up for this second speech. And you could talk to your classmates. They could all benefit from learning how to do these things, because just about all of you will have to do all three of those things when you go on the job market. Another genre that you could pick for this speech is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do in every job that I've ever had. And that is explaining to people what it is that I do, and more importantly, what it is that I don't do. A lot of people will come to you and they'll have misconceptions about your job, and that actually makes your job harder to do. So if you're going to take up this genre, there's a couple opportunities available to you. But one thing you can do is to say, here are some common misconceptions about my field, and here are some things that I think you all should know so that you don't judge people in my field the wrong way or ask them to do things that they're not trained to do or crack jokes that are offensive about them. So you might be familiar, a couple years ago, there was a set of internet memes that were circulating, and it was, here's what this group thinks I do, here's what this group thinks I do, here's what this group thinks I do, here's what I actually do. That's one genre that you could take up in this speech. So if I were to do that with jobs that I've had in the past, I used to work at a writing center, and I would get really annoyed because we'd have a lot of people come in, and they would come to the writing center, and they would say, here's my paper, fix my grammar. And all of my training at the writing center, and pretty much every writing center I've ever encountered, will say that that's not really what the writing center is for. It's not there to just fix things for you. We might be able to help you with spelling and grammar and things like that, but if we're going to do that, it usually comes at the end of the written canons. It's usually the end of style after you've done the invention and arrangement work. So if you come to me and your thesis isn't there or doesn't make sense, if you come to me and you don't have good supporting evidence, or if you come to me and your speech is all poorly arranged, having perfect spelling and grammar isn't going to help you all that much. The other reason why a lot of writing centers don't do things that way is because if the writing consultant fixes things for you, then you're not really learning. And so a lot of people come to writing centers and they say, it's kind of like, give me a fish and I'll eat for a day. And the writing center motto is more like, teach a person how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. So if you have trouble with spelling and grammar, you can go to the Writing Center, but they'll probably be more inclined to teach you the general rules rather than fixing individual things for you. But most of the time, Writing Centers actually do a lot of really good things, and a lot of people have this misconception that Writing Centers are only for remedial work. Some of the best consultations I had working at a Writing Center were with advanced writers who were really good and really clever, but they were just stuck at a particular place, and my job was to help get them unstuck. So that was my first job that I had. A second job that I had, unfortunately, was working at a coffee shop. I actually really enjoyed working at a coffee shop. There are some days where I sometimes miss just serving coffee for 8 hours a day and not using too much of my brain. My favorite thing at the coffee shop were the customers who would come in, and they were kind of judgmental of the fact that I was working there. And they were usually business people in suits, and they'd come in and stare at the menu. It's 6 or 7 in the morning, and they'd say, "I'll have a grande." And as soon as they said grande, I would say, "No, you won't," and I'd pick on them. And the reason for that is because I was working at a non-Starbucks coffee shop, and if you're going to judge me for my job, I'm going to pick on you for being a customer and not knowing where you're at. So that was just some fun I had. Now, when I took that job, my father said to me, "Well, how hard can it be to serve coffee? Day 1, tell them a cup of coffee is $5. Day 2, tell them the cup of coffee is $5 with a straight face." Nevertheless, I had a lot of fun working at a coffee shop. I happened to really enjoy that. From then, I went to work at a summer camp, and I worked at a summer camp for a few years, and my father said to me, why don't you get a job why don't you get an internship that will help you more with career advancement? And I said to him, this is the job that will help me with my career advancement. I'm learning a lot of skills as a camp counselor that will be useful to me when I go into teaching. It'll be useful for me when I work with students in the future. At that same summer camp, I ended up being an education director, and so that was actually some of the things that got me into grad school the first time. From then on, I went on to communication as a field, and I would get a whole bunch of really annoying people saying things like, "Oh, communication is a phony major," like that clip from The Simpsons. "Oh, or you're getting a degree in communication. What are you going to do with that?" And I say, "I want to teach." And they'd say, "No, but what if it doesn't work out and you don't want to teach?" And I said, "Well, I want to teach." And here I am a few years later. I'd get people saying things like, "Oh, communication, are you going to be a journalist?" And I said, actually, there's a whole bunch of things in communication. Journalism is kind of the opposite of what I actually do. There are some people in communication who do that, but I'd spend a lot of time explaining to people what it is that we do and don't do. From then on, I went to graduate school, and we like to pick on graduate students for spending 5 or 6 years of their lives making very low pay. There was a point in time where I probably qualified for food stamps, but it's something that I really wanted. I had a passion, and ultimately I got this job as a professor, and now I spend a lot of my time with a bunch of politicians who say, well, if you only teach 2 classes, you're only actually working 6 hours a week, which is ridiculous. I'm in class 6 hours a week, but there are a few weeks where I only spend 40 hours working. Usually it's closer to 50 or 60. Sometimes it's even 70 or 80. The classroom time that I spend is only a small part of my job. The public speaking part of my job is only half of my teaching assignment, and that's only about a quarter of my job as a whole. I spend a lot of time researching and writing. So what I'm getting at here is you can use this speech to do what I just did and try to demonstrate to other people, here you have some misconceptions about what I do, here's what I actually do and why it matters. Now I'll tell you, I've had some really good speeches in the past that have refuted stereotypes about male nurses. I had a good one that talked about what forensic psychologists do and how they're not just a whole bunch of morbid people who like studying death. I had a good one that distinguished physical therapy and occupational therapy. So there's a lot of options that you can choose there. One caveat that I have for you all is I'm giving you a lot of options for the second speech. Your lab instructor might have a different vision of what the second speech looks like. If your lab instructor and I happen to disagree on anything, they're ultimately the ones grading you, so I'm going to tell you to go with their default. But nevertheless, this is an option for you. You can refute misconceptions about your field. You can also, closely related to that, try to challenge someone who would tell you that your field is not a real techne, that your field isn't something that somebody should go into. It's not something that's worthy of study. It's not something that somebody should spend a career building. This happens to be a sample speech from one of my favorite teachers, a man named Taylor Mali. Taylor Mali also happens to be a slam poet on the side. He has a bit that he calls What Teachers Make, And it's a challenge to a relative who said, you don't really make anything. You don't really make a whole lot of money.
This poem is called What Teachers Make, or Objection Overruled, or if things don't work out, you can always go to law school. He says the problem with teachers is, what's a kid going to learn from someone who decided that his best option in life is to become a teacher? He reminds the other dinner guests that it's true what they say about teachers, those who can do and those who can't teach. I decide to bite my tongue instead of his and resist the urge to remind the other dinner guests that it's also true what they say about lawyers, because we're eating after all, and this is supposed to be polite conversation. I mean, you're a teacher, Taylor. Come on, be honest. What do you think? And I wish he hadn't done that. Asked me to be honest. Because you see, I have this little policy in my classroom about honesty and ass-kicking, which is if you ask for it, then I have to let you have it. You want to know what I make? I make kids work harder than they ever thought they could. I can make a C+ feel like a Congressional Medal of Honor, and I can make an A- feel like a slap in the face. How dare you waste my time with anything less than your very best. I make kids sit through 40 minutes of study hall in absolute. No, you may not work in groups. No, you cannot ask me a question. Why won't I let you go to the bathroom? Because you're bored and you don't really have to go to the bathroom, do you? I make parents tremble in fear when I call home at around dinner time. Hi, this is Mr. Molly. Hope I haven't called at a bad time. I just wanted to talk to you about something that your son said today in class. To the biggest bully in the grade, he said, leave that kid alone. I still cry sometimes, don't you? And that was the noblest act of courage that I have ever seen. I make parents see their children for who they are and who they can be. You want to know what I make? I make kids wonder. I make them question. I make them criticize. I make them apologize and mean it. I make them write. And then I make them read. I make them spell. Definitely beautiful. Definitely beautiful. Until they will never misspell either one of those words again. I make them show all their work in math class and then hide it on their final drafts in English. I make them realize that if you've got this, then you follow this. And if somebody ever tries to judge you based on what you make, you give them this. Here, let me break it down for you so you know what I say is true. Teachers make a goddamn difference. And what about you?
So the refutation is one genre that you could use for this techne speech. There's another genre that's pretty common for technical speaking, and that is what's called the elevator pitch. The elevator pitch is called that because it was designed to be thinking about how you would make a pitch to your boss if the two of you were trapped in an elevator going from the top floor to the bottom floor. How could you explain to your boss why they should hire you, why they should fund a particular project of yours, why you should get promoted, why you should get hired in just about 30 seconds? Now, obviously, your speeches for this class are going to be a little bit longer than 30 seconds. They're around 5 minutes. But you could make an elevator pitch about why you are a good candidate for a particular job that you want. You could talk about your dream job. You could talk about how you're going to set yourself up for that dream job. For any of you who have watched Shark Tank, this is essentially what they're doing on that show as well. They have a product, they've designed this product, they've invented it, they've tested it out on the market. They make an elevator pitch to the sharks, and the sharks rip them apart for it and tell them that it's a terrible idea, and then maybe one of them decides, it's pretty terrible, but I'll fund it anyway. This is the kind of genre that you could give for this speech, explaining something that you are excited or passionate about in your field. It could also be that maybe you're not going to talk about why you're qualified for a job, but something that's happening in your field that you're particularly excited about. Maybe there's a new trend that's happening in your field. Maybe there's some new technology that's getting developed. Techne also is the root of technology. A lot of our technology is designed to make our lives better, but it also requires special skills and special training. So there's lots of options you could do there that have to do with how you would sell yourself when you're on the market. I'll tell you that when I was a graduate student, one of the last tasks I had to do after writing my 200-page dissertation was making a mini speech out of it where I had to explain my 200-page dissertation in 2 minutes. UND has a similar contest. We call it 3-minute thesis, but you have to explain what's relevant about your project to somebody outside of your field. That is not an easy skill to do. I'll tell you that I had a student on a course evaluation for my technical communication class say, I thought this was a class in teaching me how to communicate to other people in my field, not how to communicate my major dumbed down. And I had to explain to that student that it's not really about dumbing down your major, but if you get up and you talk the same way you talk to experts in your field as you would to members of the general public, A, they're not going to understand you. You're probably going to use a lot of jargon, a lot of specialized language and theory. B, you're probably not going to be all that interesting to them. And C, they're probably not going to be all that interested in you. So I want you to think about how you might use this speech to communicate things about your field that would be interesting, relevant, and well communicated to people outside of it. There's one more option that I think you all could consider, and that is to do what Taylor Mali does and what I do. That is to teach your audience something unique about your field. So you could get up and you could say, there's this theory in psychology, or there's this idea that's happening in electrical engineering, or some kind of political thing that you could talk about. You can teach your audience a theory or an idea that they are not very likely to know. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes that we have together today teaching you one of those theories. It's a theory that developed in communication in the 1930s. It was developed by a man named Alan Monroe. It doesn't have the most exciting or sexy title. It is Monroe's Motivated Sequence. Monroe's Motivated Sequence is a 5-part problem solution speech that's designed to be what you see on the right side of the screen here. It's an emotional roller coaster. This was designed in communication, but it's been picked up by business, it's been picked up by marketing, it's been picked up by politicians. It's the backbone of every infomercial that you've ever seen. You all are going to go home tonight, and I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry that you will not be able to watch any commercials on television ever again without thinking about Monroe's Motivated Sequence. Part of why I'm teaching this to you is because it's a way to demonstrate how you might use your speech to teach your audience something new. Part of why I teach it to you also is because it's incredibly persuasive. That's why a lot of people teach it. A lot of politicians use this. A lot of religious leaders will use Monroe's Motivated Sequence. And the reason for that is because it's an emotional roller coaster that gets you feeling all kinds of intense emotions and then is designed to get you to do whatever the speaker wants. So as speakers, you all can be more persuasive if you have something that you want somebody to do, whether that's your parents, a significant other, a friend of yours. You can use Monroe's Motivated Sequence to try and persuade them. But I also teach this to you from an audience analysis perspective, that if you recognize that someone else is using Monroe's Motivated Sequence on you, it's a tool that's often used not just for persuasion, but also for propaganda. And so if you recognize the parts of Monroe's Motivated Sequence and you recognize when someone's trying to get you to do something, you can slow down that emotional reaction of that emotional roller coaster and say, you know what, I can tell that they're trying to get me not to think too critically about this. I'm going to say that's probably not the best thing for me, and I'm going to back out. So let me show you what Monroe's Motivated Sequence is. As you can see here, it's got 5 steps. It's similar to the 5 canons that way. The 5 steps are a sequence, so they do go in order. The first step of Monroe's Motivated Sequence is what Monroe called the attention step. This is pretty similar to what a lot of you do in your introductions already. You try to get your audience's attention. You might ask them a rhetorical question. You might tell them a joke. You might start off with a story of some kind. Whatever you do, you want to get your audience to pay attention and to be interested in your topic and to get them to listen to what you have to say about it. From there, the next 2 steps are a pretty standard problem solution speech. So right now, they're not really all that different from what you've already covered in this class. But the second step of Monroe's Motivated Sequence is what he called the needs step. The needs step is to introduce some kind of problem. And that problem is something that's pretty bad. It might be a problem that you didn't know that you had. It could vary in terms of its severity. But nevertheless, it's a problem that you want your audience to be afraid of. You want them to see it as urgent. You want them to see it as this big problem. And you want them to feel fear. There's a lot of persuasion theory, social science, communication research that says that fear appeals are probably the strongest motivating factor when we talk about emotions. People respond really well when they're scared, and they will likely do what you want them to if they feel a sense of urgency. So for the sake of demonstrating Monroe's motivated sequence, I'm going to tell you all that you have terrible dandruff. And I love doing this exercise because in like 30 seconds or so, a bunch of you are going to be scratching your heads and looking for dandruff on your clothing. But I'm going to tell you that you not only have terrible dandruff, but I'm going to try and make it sound as scary as possible. If you want to go on a date with someone and they see that you have a horrible dandruff, they're probably not going to think that you're going to be a good mate. If you have horrible dandruff and your friends want to hang out with you, they might think that you don't shower. They might think you're gross. If you're at a job interview and your suit or your dress is covered in dandruff, they're probably not going to think you're the best kind of employee. So you want to make this step feel as scary as possible, because the more scary you can make it, the more likely your audience is to pay attention and to be with you in that fear. You can probably guess that the next step of Monroe's motivated sequence then is to calm down that fear. Yes, there is some kind of problem, but let me tell you, I've got the perfect solution to it. And it's also a solution that you didn't know existed for the problem that you didn't know you had. So I'm going to walk you through a possible solution. I'm going to say that there is a kind of dandruff shampoo that you can buy, and it will get rid of that dandruff for you. Like with our beer commercials, I'm not endorsing this particular product, but I'm going to say, for the sake of example, this shampoo will get rid of all of your dandruff. The satisfaction step is the solution to your problem. And it's a way to get your audience to calm down. So they've been through fear, they've been calmed down now. Up until this point, it's a pretty standard problem solution format. Part of what makes Monroe's motivated sequence viable is that it doesn't stop there, though. It switches from a problem solution speech to more of a chronological organization pattern. So the next step that Monroe introduced is what he called the visualization step. That visualization step is, like I said, chronological. It goes past, present, future. Your past is really scary, your present is even scarier, but I'm going to give you some kind of solution. That fourth step is what Monroe called visualization. And visualization takes one of three possibilities. Either they say, you're not going to listen to me anyway, so your life is just going to be terrible because you won't listen to me, and it's a way of guilting your audience to try and get them to listen to you. Or they could say, most commonly, imagine how much better your life will be if you get rid of all that dandruff. Picture all the things that will happen in your life if you can make that work. A lot of really good Monroe's motivated sequences, speeches will do a combination of both of those things, where it'll start off with, here are all the problems that will happen to you if you don't listen to me. Here are all the good things that will happen if you do listen to me. There's a reason why religious figures and politicians like Monroe's motivated sequence. So for our sake, let's say I scared you off with all the things that wouldn't happen if you had terrible dandruff. Now in the visualization step, I'm going to tell you that if you listen to me and buy my shampoo, you'll get the job that you want, you'll get to date the person you want to date, and your friends are going to be friends with you again because they're not going to think you're gross. That's the visualization step. And ultimately, what all of this leads to is what Monroe called the action step. The action step is designed not just to get them to say, hey, there is a problem and there is a solution, but I'm going to act on that right now. Part of why Monroe's motivated sequence is so persuasive is because it's not just about changing minds, it's about changing behaviors. And so it's not just about getting your audience to see that there is a solution, getting them to think, yeah, next time I'm at the store, I might try that shampoo. The action step is going to try and get them to do it right now. It's going to be as clear and specific as possible. This product is available at these particular stores. Go there now. We're doing a trial run and supplies are limited, so if you don't act now, you're not going to get what you want. It'll flash maybe a number on a screen in an infomercial and say, call this number right now. Make sure you call it. Because if you don't act on it right now, you're probably not going to. So Monroe's motivated sequence is one of those things that works really well for getting people to do what you want. I'll end today by showing you an example of Monroe's motivated sequence. I'll tell you that this is a real product because it's one that I get questions about every time. I want you to see if you can pick out the steps in Monroe's motivated sequence, and then I'm curious if you would actually buy the product.
Does the shoulder strap of your car cut into your shoulder? Is your shoulder strap too tight and annoying? Introducing the Teddy Bear, the cute little guy that eliminates all those problems. Designed to make driving more comfortable, the Teddy Bear snaps onto your shoulder strap and moves up and down to remove the pressure wherever you need.
My shoulder strap used to pull so tight I could hardly breathe. Now with the Teddy Bear, I really enjoy traveling again.
The patent-pending design swivels to work from either the driver's side or passenger seat and fits all makes and models. Just snap it on, slide it where it relieves the pressure, and drive away. The Teddy Bear stays where you want it until you move it.
My wife used to always complain about the pressure
from her shoulder belt. Not anymore.
And the teddy bear works so great, he got one for himself too.
The Cuddly Teddy Bear is filled with soft, cushy beads, so it snuggles comfortably to your needs. Place it here, or anywhere you need to keep those irritating scraps from digging in.
My shoulder strap was always digging in, but the teddy bear, it makes it comfortable for me to drive with.
The Teddy Bear works great for men and women and kids of all sizes. It works for everyone. It's easy to slide out of the way when not in use. The secure snap-on button makes the Teddy Bear safe and fun for infants and small children.
If you're in and out of your car all day like I am, you really enjoy the comfort of the teddy bear.
Now you can have your own Teddy Bear and eliminate those annoying shoulder strap pains. Call and order your Teddy Bear right now.
Because you need 2 of them. All right, you probably get the point. You can see how the different parts of Monroe's motivated sequence are there. Hopefully I've given you some ideas for invention and some inspiration for you to get started on your second speech. Best of luck. I'll see you all next week.